Fellas, it's hard being a UFC fan in 2025. Listen, I know that we've had some good cards recently. I'm not trying to be an ungrateful fan. We've had some good cards. We've even got some really good cards coming up that I'm looking forward to. But I feel like the UFC, rather than being consistently good, they're trying to prioritize being occasionally great and consistently terrible. And I'm definitely not the only person online who has this opinion. I mean, if you look at the most recent Apex card we've had in the UFC, there was no crowd for it in front of the Apex, no big names on the card, weak main event, and it was overall just cheap slop. And you can literally say this about any other Apex card we've ever had, especially recently in 2025. It might have had one or two or maybe a couple of good performances, but the overall takeaway is that it's been a weak main event, cheap slop, and just not really that good of a card. And it's not that the UFC don't know what they're doing. When the UFC put effort into a card, they can really stack a card. We know what it's like when we see a stacked UFC card because everybody talks about it. I mean, every single Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabian card that the UFC put on tends to be stacked, whereas every Apex card just seems like a bit of slop that they've put together to fulfill their ESPN contract, and therefore it's just not the best thing to see as a fan. And there's been so many bad Apex cards that has resulted in us getting back cards as a fan, and I'm sick of these fans being like, dude, the UFC are so back whenever we get like a good card and like hyping up every good card that we get. The only reason we're getting these good cards is because the rest of the cards are having to suffer through. We're having to go through these terrible pay-per-views so that we can get good cards. I mean, look at UFC 314 and UFC 312. The only reason 314 is overstacked is because they had to make UFC 312 underwhelming. There's just no consistency with the UFC cards. What the UFC fans don't want these cards where sometimes a pay-per-view will be trash, sometimes it'll be solid, sometimes we'll get a really good pay-per-view, but genuinely it's inconsistent. I think fans would prefer solid pay-per-views all around. Not saying we need 10 out of 10 UFC 300 cards every time, but just solid pay-per-views every time with an occasionally really good stacked card that the UFC might put on once or twice a year. And before everyone starts saying that every single card can be stacked, I disagree. I think that's bullshit. Look at the average UFC month back in 2019. You'd start off with a pay-per-view. I mean, look at, for example, this time in 2019, you had two title fights, Jones versus Smith, Woodley versus Usman, followed up by Derek Lewis versus Dos Santos, where Dos Santos knocked out Lewis, followed up by Till versus Masvidal in the UK, where Masvidal put Till to sleep, followed up by Showtime Pettis versus Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, where Pettis cracked the chin of Wonderboy Thompson, followed up by Gaethje versus Barboza. All of this is in a crowded arena, by the way, where Gaethje ends up knocking out Edson Barboza. You look at an average UFC month in 2025, UFC Seattle ruined by an eye poke, Manel Cat versus Azul Amabayev ruined by an eye poke, Ankalaev versus Pereira, underwhelming main event, didn't look the best, and then we had Delite versus Vittori recently, which was a bit of a slot put together for a main event, a rematch that nobody asked for. Back then, we had a month full of fights, it was a stacked card every card, it was between top contenders, and it was in crowded venues nearly every single time. Nowadays, we might have a month full of fights, but it genuinely isn't stacked every card. It's not really between the top contenders or big names, and it ain't in crowded venues. It just means like the UFC quality of the cards have massively deteriorated. And you can tell when we get like an Apex card that might be better than others, and fans start hyping it up, and you can tell they've never watched the UFC pre-Apex when every single card on a weekly basis was pretty much stacked. And even from a casual perspective, you look at all the current UFC champions, and there's only about 3 pay-per-view draws in the UFC right now. Jones doesn't even fight, which kind of rules him off. Makachev's a big star, but does he sell pay-per-views in the West? And Topuria is not really a champion anymore. So from a casual perspective, they're struggling with star power. And I feel like nowadays a stacked fight night would just be considered an average card back then, like pre-COVID era of the UFC. And then let's go on to pay-per-view prices as well. We know how money-hungry Dana White is with the pay-per-view prices. I find it crazy that UFC 312, which I think was the worst pay-per-view mod in history, was $79.99, and that's not even counting the additional $12.99 that people had to pay for their ESPN Plus subscription if they hadn't had it already, which is expensive. And then you look at the boxing card, the Last Crescendo, one of the most stacked boxing cards of all time. It costed $25.99 plus a $24.99 for the DAZN subscription, which is still expensive, but when you really look at the quality between the boxing cards and the UFC cards, it's completely different. And I don't mind it if they're going to charge a lot of money for a UFC 300 type card or a Conor McGregor card or even like a UFC 314, a really, really stacked card. But when UFC 312 or just terrible pay-per-views or below average or even just average pay-per-views are $79.99, they should be at least $49.99. Even that's expensive. But I feel like the pay-per-views are still over, but they're overcharging for the pay-per-views. Like, how is UFC 312 and 300 a similar price when the quality of the card's completely different? Somebody calculated that the cost of being a UFC fan on a yearly basis is about $1,000. If you take everything into account, all the subscriptions, and there's a reason why UFC pay-per-views have been reportedly getting lower and lower, why people think the UFC is struggling with the pay-per-views. This might be the whole reason why they're trying to switch to Netflix instead of ESPN. But even then, you go on to the next topic, fights that the fans want to see. We ain't getting that. We ain't getting the fights that we want to see. Listen, I'm bored of talking about Aspinall and Jones. I'm sure you're bored of hearing about it, but it's got to be mentioned. You've got Jones taking on Stipe, a fight that fans didn't want to see when we were asking for it. I mean, even in America, even in New York, where John Jones is from, the crowd are chanting Tom Aspinall's name. And the UFC, they didn't put this fight on for the fans. They put it on to sell a pay-per-view with two big names, knowing that Jones makes a UFC bag and sticks around a little bit longer. And this whole Jones-Aspinall situation, Jones is asking for 6 months to prepare. And I think Chael Sonnen put it perfectly. Did he not know that the undisputed champion was going to take on the interim champion? It's pretty straightforward. 6 months to prepare. The UFC fans want Jones versus Aspinall. And you know, it's evident every single, even like the community post that the UFC put on, the comment section just spammed with Jones versus Aspinall. This is the most demanded fight right now in MMA. And if Jones refuses or he, you know, extends it for way too long, just strip him from the belt. The UFC ain't going to do this because, like I've been saying all along, they ain't doing it for the fans. The UFC are just too money hungry, in my opinion, nowadays. Even the whole Pereira versus Ankalaev situation, where Pereira had to fight Roundtree and Ankalaev had to go and fight Alexander Rakic before their title fight was made. Or O'Malley versus Merab, where O'Malley defended against Marlon Vera and Merab had to go and beat Henry Cejudo. And I just feel like it's a massive case. And if Merab has to defend his belt against Sean O'Malley, that's another example. Nobody wants to see O'Malley in an immediate rematch. He hasn't earned it. He's had 0 wins since he's lost to Merab. So that's bullshit as well. And on top of that, what the fans want, we want the best versus the best. We want the Makhachev versus Poirier in June. I know it's a bit of a sticky situation. I went over this in a video previously. That's the fight we want in June. If not, put all the contenders together and fight the #1 contender in October for Islam Makhachev. We don't want to see Justin Gaethje. The only reason the UFC would put this on is because it's an easy, quick pay-per-view, and those Americans who don't really watch the sport but just know the name of Justin Gaethje can go and get hyped up about Gaethje getting a title shot for the chance that he wins and he's going to get ragdolled. Where's Chimaev versus DDP? Where's the news on this? Where's this super fight, maybe not a super fight, but this big fight between Merab and Pantoja? Why are we getting fights like Aldo versus Zahabi, which is not a fan-friendly fight, or Vettori versus Dolidze 2, which is not a fan-friendly fight? It just seems like the UFC and Dana White have completely different opinions to what the UFC fans actually want, and they seem to be in a completely different world, and it just seems to be so star-orientated, where the UFC need to find a star. If they can't find a star, if they can't get a star in every division, then they're going to be struggling. I mean, look at this weekend, for example. Since we're going to the UK, let's talk about the last time the UFC went to the UK, at UFC 304, when they started at 3 AM local time, which is still one of the dumbest decisions the UFC have done. People were falling asleep in the arena, and Dana White had the audacity to call out the fact that fighters were underperforming in the post-fight press conference, saying, oh, you know, it was 7 AM in Vegas, and he had to blame it on other people. It wasn't for the local fans, it wasn't for the fighters, it was just so we might be able to get a couple more pay-per-views at the expense of a deteriorating event because of the fans and the fighters, which showed in the performances. And on top of that, he cuts Makhachev, bans bonuses over 50k, blames the fighters, and again starts going on this ramble about it being 7 AM in Vegas. Does that sound like a guy who's doing it for the fans? I feel like the biggest problem with this is the lack of competitors with the UFC. The UFC basically is MMA nowadays because there's no competitors. When you think of MMA, you think of UFC. When casuals are talking about MMA, they're rarely, you know, alluding to UFC. I mean, the biggest competitor is probably PFL, but they have probably 3 big events a year. Their biggest draws are probably Ngannou, Usman Nurmagomedov, Paul Hughes. Ngannou, I mean, those are the only draws. Francis Ngannou has only had 1 fight in PFL. The other 2 ain't anywhere close to the biggest stars in the UFC as well. And then the rest of the top fighters, the champions in PFL, none of them are pay-per-view draws. None of them could sell a pay-per-view. None of them are big names. Then you've got GFL, which I don't think people are really taking too seriously. When you've got Dylan Dennis versus Tony Ferguson as a main event, that kind of tells everything. And Frank Mir fighting in 2025. That says everything you need to know about the event. And every other MMA organization, they might be big in a specific and, you know, niche region, but they don't even compete with the UFC because the UFC can afford to slack. They can keep giving us these slop events, these terrible events, without any stress, essentially, because the UFC can afford to slack because fans have literally no alternative. It's either branded UFC slop or slop from these other smaller organizations. So I just feel like the UFC don't really care about the fans or fighters, which is something I'm getting into as well. I'm not trying to be this, you know, oh, the UFC don't pay their fighters, but let's go over this whole fighter pay topic. Now, I understand that when it comes to the UFC and other organizations like NFL and NBA, the UFC don't make anywhere near as much revenue on a yearly basis as these companies do. And, you know, when we've got guys like Justin Tafa, Dontel Mays, and Alex Morono in the UFC, and just these really low-tier fighters, do they really deserve to be getting paid more than 20k to show, 20k to win? Because I don't think they do. I think these certain fighters are getting paid exactly what they deserve. But when it gets to the point where Pantojan, a champion, who was fighting for a belt Moreno, previous to that title fight, was working at Uber Eats to make a living, and you've got fighters who don't even get there, you know, they get absolutely battered in the octagon, and then they've got to pay expenses. And then you've got Dana White paying hundreds of thousands to the fucking Nelk boys, and all these different content creators that Dana White seems to be obsessing over. And when he's refusing to acknowledge Tom Aspinall and obsessing over Callum Walsh, a boxer who has nothing to do with the UFC, it makes no sense in my opinion. And even with the bonuses that they raised for UFC 300 and UFC 304, they decided to never do again. Why is it a 50k bonus? They've never even raised it to a 75k bonus. At least increase the bonuses naturally. And I get revenue going to fighters and players. It's something I'm going to talk about as well. UFC gives 17% of the revenue to the fighters, and whereas NFL and NBA give a 48 and a 50%, so basically half of the revenue going into the company goes back to the players. The UFC only really gives 17%, which I find is crazy. And then they're cutting fighters, like they're cutting Rosenstrike after one decision loss to Pavlovich, and Taylor Lapillus, who was actually a big prospect in the division, and Mohamed Makayev, who was on a big winning streak, but they keep Justin Tafa, or Junior Tafa, in the UFC. He's one of the worst fighters in the organization, and Dontel Mayes, who's a fat, unathletic heavyweight who can't buy a win. It just seems like the UFC nowadays, I don't really understand what's going on. They're firing fighters, they're putting on these events that nobody wants to see. It doesn't seem like it's for the fans. What UFC fans are craving the most is, first of all, violence. We want to see good fights. We want to see violence in the octagon. I get that. Second thing is the best versus the best. We want to see these fights between the best versus the best. And I feel like the UFC is taking way too long and aren't communicating enough with this whole Jones Aspinall situation. And third of all, we want consistency. I've said this before, I think, and I speak on behalf of myself at least, that I would rather see consistent, solid, and stacked UFC cards than occasionally having a really, really good card that's like 10 out of 10, and then having to resort to these terrible pay-per-views like UFC 312 and UFC 309 every now and then. But that's just my thoughts on the UFC and what they've been doing recently. It doesn't seem like they're really being fan-friendly. It doesn't seem like they're putting on the fights for the fans. And I feel like 2025, I've said this multiple times, could have been one of the biggest years for the UFC. But we're 3.5 months in, and it doesn't seem like it's going that way. Maybe the UFC are going to pull off something crazy towards the end of the year and, you know, pull off these big fights. But right now, I think it's quite tough to be a UFC fan in 2025 with everything going on. Let me know your thoughts, and if you agree, thank you for watching.